What we see with Christopher LeBron's chapter on American shame and real freedom, a chapter that introduces his recent book on the making of Black Lives Matter, is that the mythic themes of the Civil War are not ancient history for us. Those themes do not organize a chapter of our past that we've moved away from. Last time, we looked at how Lincoln has come to figure in American self-understanding as a defender, a heroic defender, of equality under the law. The first inaugural, the Gettysburg Address, they highlighted for us the persistent presence of redemptive violence in our mythos. And here we see it most, I think, explicitly in the first inaugural. The mystic cords of memory are called, they're said to, stretch from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land. We're connected to this, right? And our job here, the task remaining before us, is to make sure that those honored dead exist as something from which we take increased devotion, that we organize our mythos according to them. This redemptive violence is pervasive. We celebrate, then as now, the last full measure of devotion given by the ones who fight and die in our wars. And we see here, I've pulled there's many examples of this online. I haven't made these little images, I've pulled them. We celebrate then as now that last full measure, and this celebration of military service and the sacrifice it entails, it ebbs and flows through our history. Because we're at a point in history right now where celebration of martial sacrifice is at an all-time high, where supporting our troops is among the very few nonpartisan issues in our national self-consciousness, even while our military service members comprise less than 1% of our population and are increasingly isolated from that larger population, and because this is a relatively new set of circumstances, not an historically stable national characteristic, because of all that, we will return to this, to the central role of the American service member in our national mythos. Suffice it to say for now that Lincoln, not for the first time in the nation's history, enshrined the central role of the martial hero in our national self-understanding, our civil religion, in one of the most celebrated and most brief speeches in our national canon. But he began that speech with the theme that will follow today, equality, and especially equality under the law. Now is a good time to mention the Thaddeus Stevens Senate floor speech voiced by Tommy Lee Jones in the film Lincoln, which is posted, the clip of which is posted to our website. It's a dramatically pretty awesome articulation of this principle, and I recommend it to you, though for Stevens, it was a profound compromise. He wanted to argue for equality, and he settled for pragmatic reasons on arguing for equality under the law. Equality under the law, it was and it continues in our own time to be a principled, value-laden, mythic assertion of national identity. It also was, and also continues to be, an assertion that's betrayed by institutional practice and by the extra-institutional behaviors of those claiming a patriotic adherence to America and to the ideals for which America stands. LeBron writes, "Our standards of liberty and protection under the law to which we, as a nation, claim to be committed tend to falter and collapse when blacks depend on those standards and commitments." Institutionally, we see that falter and that collapse in the prison industrial complex. I recommend to you Ava DuVernay's recent documentary, 13th, which traces the racially and financially motivated underbelly of that system, and it's available on Netflix. Institutionally, we see that falter and that collapse on the streets and in the courts. LeBron draws our attention to the murders of Brandon McClellan and Eric Garner. The list of names to be added to these two is staggeringly long. Black people unjustly, unconscionably, inhumanely killed by people in positions of authority, whose oath is to protect and to serve, or by people who assume that authority, who, vigilante-style, take upon themselves the job of protecting and serving. Out of many motives, I'm sure, but mostly out of fear of the other, fear of black people and the criminality to which that white American culture has so long attributed to them, or fear of a black planet. And if you haven't already, I recommend you go listen to some Public Enemy. We see that falter and that collapse when murderers go free for these acts, these modern-day lynchings. When Eric Garner was killed on video in July of 2014, LeBron reminds us that you can hear Garner telling the officer who had him in a chokehold that he can't breathe. The officer in that case, and in so very many others, went free. The May 2020 murder of George Floyd, similarly at the hands of an officer of the law, was similarly caught on video, and Floyd, like Garner, pleaded with his last words saying that he couldn't breathe. 2020 offers a different response, Immediate protests, thousands and thousands of protesters in the streets calling for a societal and cultural transformation that supports an authentic engagement of and adherence to the principle of equality under the law. These protesters see themselves as forced into a societal and cultural position, despite the public health risks of an ongoing pandemic, into a position where they must continue to assert a claim that on the surface is evident in this nation's Declaration of Independence, is self-evident, that all men are created equal, the claim that Black lives matter. The need to assert this, to build a movement out of the assertion, is testament to the centuries of institutional and extra-institutional betrayal of the insistence with which Lincoln begins the Gettysburg Address, that this nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men, and I'd add women, are created equal. Now, LeBron focuses our attention on two historical luminaries, Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells, who also called out this betrayal, who insisted that, in LeBron's words, no nation can call itself either democratic or civilized when it permits killings of and violence against its racial minorities. A nation can certainly kill and violate, but it cannot at the same time call itself civilized and democratic. And a nation can certainly claim that liberty and justice for all is its goal and its moral mandate, but to do so while supporting institutional or extra-institutional lynchings is to engage in a particularly heinous form of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is the vice most consonant, as LeBron tells us, with the experience of shame. And that is what Douglass strives to elicit. His quarrel wasn't with the idea of America or with its democratic principles. It was with their hypocritical betrayal, with the betrayal of those ideals and principles. And what he strove to inculcate in his white readers and listeners was a sense of shame. Shame on the part of slaveholders, as with his former master Thomas Auld, but shame also on the part of those complicit in a society that supported this fundamentally unjust practice. Shame on the part of those who have some, however provisional, power, and who remain quiet to avoid confrontation, to stay out of the fray. By remaining in the echo chambers of their own self-confirming media circles or political enclaves, that, he insists, is moral cowardice, and it is pervasive in this nation then and now. What it requires in response is a moral realignment. As LeBron puts it, Douglass saw that America didn't need a new founding. The resources for change, for a more perfect union, for the institutionalization of justice, those resources are already there, the principles deeply embedded in our polity, in our collective sense of self, in our national mythos. What then, this is LeBron's question, and is the question of this course, what then, if anything, could be decisive in shifting America to act more in accord with the principles upon which it is founded? For Douglass, it was rhetoric. It was using the moral authority of his position as a former slave to induce shame and hopefully moral realignment in those who claimed to stand for the national ideals that he ceaselessly championed. Now, a couple generations later, after the institutions of law had outlawed slavery and granted equal protections, but during the era of Jim Crow lynchings, Ida B. Wells placed a great responsibility in and faith in journalism. She too celebrated the founding principles and constitutional law, and she saw journalism, expanded enormously by the modernization of print media, as the venue through which to educate people. What could be decisive in shifting America to act in accordance with its founding principles? And her answer is education. And newspapers, they had a huge role in that. The challenge then with newspapers, and now with cable news and social media, was to not compromise truth for sales, to not let the market shape or guide ideals understood to be of fundamental value and mythic power. Now, she sacrificed a great deal for truth in media. And we can all take this as a cautionary tale, maybe a bit of a rebuke, hopefully as an inspiration. How do we use media? How do we support media? The instruments so readily at our disposal today can teach, as Murrow insisted of TV in the mid-century. They can illuminate, they can even inspire, but they can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use them to those ends. The danger then as now is complacency, it's isolationism, and the self-inflicted bait and switch of conscience that we've allowed ourselves to grow accustomed to, where clicking on or liking a politically sound media moment is allowed to act as a stand-in for authentic engagement, action, political commitment. And where we accept the neatly packaged political stance of one or another influencer as our own, Civic engagement just isn't that easy. It requires more of us. It requires more self-reflection. It requires more situational awareness. Douglas's and Wells' calls for national shame is not yet outdated, LeBron tells us. This strikes me as clearly true and is nationally damning. We have cause for national shame, the more so when we tout ideals without considering how our actions, social, economic, political actions, affect other people's ability to live into, embody, experience those same ideals. The notion of or commitment to a more perfect union, as I've said, has futurity and potential and change baked into it. And not for some vaguely flag or eagle-shaped national body sort of waving in red, white, and blue, but for each of us, for we, the people. There will be no more perfect union, no liberty and justice for all, no bending of the arc of the universe towards justice without the individual commitment of civic-minded people. Civic duty is real, or if it isn't, then the citizenry abdicates its role in the democracy, and power will become the measure of value. And that power is almost always monetary these days. Now, Frederick Douglass built a voice out of saying that the idea and ideals of American democracy should be used as a measure, intellectually as well as emotionally, that we need perpetual moral realignment, and that shame can motivate action. That, as per Lincoln's first inaugural, can be brought, that we can be brought to song by the better angels of our nature. So we'll turn now to a question. Can our better angels bring us to just any song? The Battle Hymn of the Republic is a war song. You read the article, and you read in it that it's been used by a dizzying array of different movements. Even if Johnny Cash was wrong about it being sung by both sides in the Civil War, which he was, he might be right that it's a song that can belong to all of us. You know, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Together with a steady drumbeat, it's inspirational, it's hopeful, it's winning, and it's self-sacrificial and righteous. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make them free. It's all about what you bring to it, we're told. So long as you bring a real sense of divinely backed martial inclinations. And it helps if you bring some Christianity, but mostly bring the fight. Ethnomusicologist Brigida Johnson reminds us of this. It can be taken in a number of ways, and it has been. It's sung in churches and at national gatherings and political movements across the nation. But however it's taken, it remains a war song. It's a call to arms. It's chock full of sacred violence. It isn't inherently unifying. And neither, of course, is our other song, the far more challenging song to face, Dixie. Qureshi talks about the pre-existing condition of the South, the lost cause of the Confederacy. And in this, I'd recommend to you a book by Trinidadian author V.S. Naipaul. It's pictured at the bottom, A Turn in the South. It's a book where he describes his travels through the American South. The book itself gives a great deal of attention to and a kind of dark but compassionate wonder in the face of the landscape's near total memorialization. The setting, he shows us, the setting itself accentuates a pervasive sense of loss, of already having lost. This is a mythos deeply embedded in the South, the lost cause, mythically transformed by Jefferson Davis and others into a cause of states' rights and liberty, of rebellion against tyranny, of rural innocence defensive and embattled in the face of a fast-paced, dehumanizing urban industrialism. And of course, that's all there. It's all at the ready. It wouldn't have been adopted so easily into the center of a culture if it weren't already there, if it didn't already have at least a germ of truth in it. But these mythic ideals, aspirations, principles, they're also all post-mortem surrogates for the real cause for fighting, the real casus belli. For the Confederacy, that reason was slavery and defending it. And these mythic ideals, they all rest upon and only lightly veil that truth, the truth of unpaid labor, of the tyranny of race, of unmitigated guilt of holding humans as property. So the lost cause, it's traceable through a whole history of facts, through a logos, sometimes countered, sometimes ignored, sometimes denied, but it's there. The history is there. But the lost cause itself is mythos. It's not logos. It's mythos through and through. It's a cultural identity for generations rooted in already having lost. And this is what stands out from Naipaul's narrative. The statues, the memorials, everywhere. to heroes of a lost war, and not just to the heroes, to the unnamed soldiers, to the families, to the women, to the loyalty of the slaves. Statues, dedicating themselves and drawing our sense of collective cultural honor and respect for the loyalty of the slaves. Now, if there's any part of you that wonders about whether taking down Robert E. Lee statues is right or just or good for our society, good for the Union, just imagine growing up as a black kid in that neighborhood, in the neighborhood where statues commemorate the loyalty of slaves. Because really that's what it's about. It's about the future. It's about the kids. It's about the myths we live by that we hand down to the next generation and the next after them. People who even today resist taking down Confederate statues, those people are operating in large part on myth. We imbibe these stories, these mythic realities, these mythic truths. We drink them in long before our cognitive capacity enables us to think critically about the history, about the logos. And these mythic truths hit us each differently, right? They put individual experience in a universal perspective. So they hit us on the level of individual experience, and that's different for each of us. A culture whose identity is an already having lost, transmuted often away from the logos, the history of slavery, that culture sees losing its memorials as a further loss, a deeper loss, the sort of imminent loss now, even of the memory of loss. Now, of course, there's another perspective that exists also in the South, that the statues should go, that they not only commemorate a time during which slavery was practiced and fought for, they also celebrate traitors to the Union, and treason just isn't something to be celebrated, not by any nation. That sense of loss, that's what Dixie's about. Dixie's born nostalgic, we read in the article. And then we go on to read that the song has been a way of steering memory away from slavery. And now, in our current political and cultural context, in the 21st century, it's easy to see that as simply damning. We don't steer memory away from slavery. We don't do that, right? Like, that's a morally culpable act. So get rid of the song. It seems easy. But what do we do with Renee Marie's love for it, insistence on reclaiming it? What do we do with that? What do we do with John Sims' claim that the song offers his art a magical opportunity for redemption? Or with the protagonist Daniel Barkley in Percival Everett's story, deciding that the song was his, the lyrics his, the Confederate flag even, his. And what about the Union version, which I've posted to our website? It loses some of the nostalgia, some of that, the sense of pain from the past. It loses some access to that fundamental human experience of loss in becoming a winning war march turned against the slaveholding culture where it sits, more often at home as an anthem. It adds humor where once loss governed the tone. Listening to Dixie and to the battle hymn, but more so to Dixie, I find myself inclined to see in it and to hear in it something different from what I see in the Confederate flag or Confederate statues. And this perspective I'm about to give is potentially problematic, might get me in trouble. But the Confederate flag, the Confederate States statues, besides that these things, the flag and the statues, directly commemorate treason, besides that, they are stable symbolic signifiers. They mean just what they mean. Their voice, visual that it is fixed. To let go of the Old South, must we disregard that sort of distinction, right? Song on the one hand, flag and statues on the other. To get rid of the Old South, to remove it from the living myths of our nation, do we need to, or ought we to, get rid of all its symbols? To say that none are recuperable, in the interest of justice, none are recuperable. The flag can't ever just mean rebellion, liberty. It can't ever just signify a kind of principled outlawishness. It also always signifies an acceptance of slavery. It signifies, however preconsciously, however, in however a mentally or psychologically tacit way, it also signifies white supremacy. And it's a traitor's rag. The statues celebrating and honoring heroes of the Confederacy aren't just celebrating courage or even dignity in defeat. They can't ever only signify martial ideals that, in fact, we share as a nation. They also always signify a defense of slavery and, however preconsciously and however mentally or psychologically tacit a way, they also always signify white supremacy. And these so-called heroes, they're also traitors. But Dixie's a little different. As you read, it's being removed from a lot of context, pulled out of a lot of context where it's seen as, too unthinkingly to signify a nostalgia for a time of slavery, nostalgia for a time when white supremacy was institutionalized through the practice of slavery. But that nostalgia is outright refused by Renee Marie's version. Strange Fruit completely neutralizes any longing. As a medley, it contextualizes that fundamental human experience of loss, such that slavery, lynching, white supremacy aren't celebrated, but condemned, trenchantly condemned. Elvis, decades earlier, maybe not quite as effectively, but decades earlier, musically overcomes the nostalgia of Dixie with the awe and enthusiasm and human smallness of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, I don't know the degree to which Dixie is recuperable. It's a hard one for me. But compared to a lot of still unrecognized aspects of our culture, of our living myths that are born of structurally racist patterns and nurtured in a culture of power and equity, compared to a lot of things in our language and art and public design and policy, Dixie's easy. In that it is readily identifiable as an aspect of our living mythos, and it's as a site for national cultural self-reflection. I don't know if at the end of the day getting rid of the Old South means letting go of Dixie. And if it does, it's a small price to pay. But if not, if a more just culture can keep this song, it will be because it's a song, and it requires voice. It's different from a statue, it's different from a flag, in this way. A more perfect union. America is about being able to change our myths. That's built into the myth itself. I think what I'd like is a reshaped Dixie, a fully reconstructed Dixie. Keep the melody slow, keep the loss and the pain of look away, look away. But the rest of the words, make them today's words, aware of history, aware of the present. I think I'd like to hear Erykah Badu rewrite this one. I think it has the potential to be a gut punch of a song. But like I said, this is a contentious viewpoint. I'm not sure I'm right, and maybe I'm wrong. And our article is right, and the song's just gotta go. And like I said, if that's true, then it's a small price to pay. Next time, we'll turn to the Spanish-American War and to the moment when fake news really became central to our national mythos in the context of war.